In 2003, a man entered a bottle depot to exchange plastic bottles for their deposit, as he'd done every week for years. The man was known in the area as a wealthy eccentric, a man who could be a bit of a nuisance, but not someone who was a danger. That specific day, though, he brought a young woman with him, and while he was busy, she slipped away and made a phone call. It wasn't long before the man was arrested, and the community learned the horrors of what was really happening in the home of the man who had become known as the Dungeon Master. This is Monsters. John Thomas Jamelske was born on May 9, 1935 in Fayetteville, New York, just east of Syracuse. By all outward appearances, he spent the early decades of his life as an unremarkable member of the working class. His father, John Sr., was a watchmaker and enjoyed repairing old clocks in his spare time. In school, John got average to below average grades and didn't participate in any extracurricular activities. He graduated from Fayetteville High School in 1953 and went to college due to his father's insistence that he earn a degree. Despite not performing well in high school, he ended up earning a degree in watchmaking from Morrisville State College. He didn't seem to use that degree and ended up working at Acme Market before moving into blue-collar trades like handyman work and carpentry that would later serve him well in ways no one could have anticipated. In September of 1959, he married Dorothy Richmond, a school teacher, and the couple settled into domestic life in DeWitt, eventually having 3 sons. John was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a difficult and eccentric man even then. He was frugal to the point of obsession, socially awkward, and prone to hoarding behavior that would intensify dramatically over the following decades. He accumulated newspapers, magazines, beer bottles, receipts, and assorted junk with a compulsion that eventually resulted in a home that was severely cluttered. It became a labyrinthine accumulation of objects that seemingly no one had the authority to make him part with. When John's father died in October of 1978, he inherited some money as well as his father's large collection of antique clocks. The sale of those clocks left him with quite a bit of money that would continue to grow through real estate investments in California and Nevada. Over the following decades, John's net worth would grow to be over $1 million. He was, by the standards of anyone watching from the outside, a wealthy eccentric, a man who had money but chose to live as though he didn't, driving an aging car, recycling bottles for their deposit, and maintaining a property that outsiders described as a hoarder's nightmare. And of course, if you have a lot of money, it doesn't mean you can't still be frugal, but his behavior being on the level of obsessiveness was a sign that he wasn't entirely healthy mentally. It was reported that he would cut coupons out of the newspaper, but not newspapers that he paid for. The newspapers you could read for free at the library. A librarian would later say that, if the coupons weren't available, John would berate the librarian on duty. Now, there are a bunch of additional details to John's early life, such as him wearing the same dirty clothes to school every day, earning him the nickname Germs, as well as an entire story about an adult John having a 16-year-old girlfriend who ended up living with him and his family. But they come from a single self-published book, and I can't find anything that confirms those details. So it's possible those things happened, but it seems unlikely. It was in 1988 that his wife Dorothy was diagnosed with colon cancer that left her bedridden until her death in 1999. With her secluded in the bedroom, John decided to use that freedom to carry out his dark fantasies. It's unknown how long John had been wanting to kidnap and sexually assault young girls, but it had likely been brewing for some time. Not much is known about his first victim, a 14-year-old Native American girl. John had gone out cruising in his old Mercury on September 17, 1988, when he managed to convince the girl known as Kristen to get into his car. He ended up taking the girl to his parents' house where there was an old well. Kristen would later say in an interview that she was intoxicated and doesn't remember getting into John's car, but she woke up in the well. She was naked and had a chain around her ankle. John told her that she was there for him to have sex with every day. John kept her in the well for 10 months while he built a bunker in his own house. The bunker itself was not a hastily improvised space, but a deliberately designed, carefully constructed facility. It was the product of months of planning and skilled manual labor. John built it with his own hands using the carpentry and construction skills he had developed over years of handyman work. Located 3 feet below ground, behind the east wall of the basement of his home in DeWitt, the bunker was reached through a concealed entrance behind a storage shelf. Behind the shelf was a steel door that opened into an 8-foot or 2.5-meter long tunnel that had to be traversed on hands and knees. The need to crawl was deliberate. It was a humiliating and disorienting crawl space that prevented anyone moving through it from standing, from running, and from mounting any effective resistance. At the end of the tunnel was a second locked steel door. Beyond that door, accessible only by stepping backward down a 3-rung ladder from a low entry point in the wall, was the main room, 8 feet or 2.5 meters high, 24 or 7.5 meters long, and 12 feet or 3.5 meters wide. It was large enough to confine a person, but small enough to feel absolutely inescapable. The room was equipped with a minimal concession to human survival. A foam mattress served as a bed. A clock radio and a small television were connected to an extension cord running through a hole in the wall from the house above. Heat came through an aluminum duct attached to the home's furnace. A bathtub, stained and set atop a raised wooden deck, was where victims were forced to bathe using a garden hose. But since the tub had no working plumbing, the water drained directly onto the cement floor and simply evaporated, keeping the room perpetually damp and prone to mold. The toilet was an aluminum frame chair with no seat positioned above a bucket. The walls of the dungeon were covered in writing. Religious phrases were interspersed with slogans and provocations. A crucifix hung by the door beside the words, "Peace to all who enter here." The phrase "wall of thugs" appeared on another surface, which investigators later used as a means of verifying the other victims' stories. The bunker was something that finally made John spend some money, as it took a great deal of rented machinery to complete. John also had the help of one of his sons, though that child wasn't aware of its intended purpose. John told his son and neighbors that he was building a bomb shelter, which perfectly tracked for the wealthy eccentric. Once the bunker was complete, John moved Kristen from the well to the dungeon underneath his house, the same house where his cancer-stricken wife was living. John controlled Kristen through threats of violence directed at her younger brother, a manipulation tactic he would refine and repeat over the following 15 years. She described that John would come in every day and rape her for the next few years. In order to keep her family from reporting her missing, John had Kristen write letters saying she had run away. He even had her call them on multiple occasions. Then, just after her 17th birthday, John decided to release Kristen, which would be a strange story on its own. John blindfolded Kristen and had his son drive them to the Syracuse Hancock Airport. He told his son that Kristen had been placed with him in order to combat a weight problem and that the blindfold was part of a practical joke. John took the blindfold off at the airport and the two flew to Nevada and stayed in Lake Tahoe for a week. Then John dropped Kristen off at the airport with a ticket back to Syracuse. She flew home on her own and was picked up by her family, who believed she had come home from voluntarily running away. John told Kristen that he knew her address and would kill her brother if she reported him, so Kristen stayed quiet and did her best to resume her life. John flew back a few days later and spent the next 4 years with an empty bunker. In March of 1995, John lured a 14-year-old Latina runaway who has remained nameless into his car under the pretext of paying her to deliver a secret package. The girl willingly entered the bunker, at which point John locked the door behind her. He held her in the dungeon for about 2 years and subjected her to repeated rape. Again, he eventually released her, but this time it was less intricate. He blindfolded her and drove her to her mother's apartment, telling her he would kill members of her family if she went to the police, even showing her pictures of her family. That didn't deter her from going to the police, where she provided a description of what had happened. But because of her history of drug use, investigators questioned the credibility of her account. They dropped the investigation not long after, essentially allowing John to remain free to kidnap another person, which he wouldn't wait 4 years to do. On August 31st, 1997, John kidnapped a 53-year-old Vietnamese refugee. Like the other victims, she was walking on the street, and despite her speaking little English, or maybe because of that, he was able to convince her to get into the car. He first took her to an abandoned house where he raped her, then he drove her to his home and locked her in his dungeon. She was held for approximately 9 months, subjected to daily rape and forced to perform various menial tasks. He released her on May 23, 1998 at a Greyhound bus station, giving her $50 in cash. She reported the abduction and sexual assaults to the police that same day, but they didn't believe her. Syracuse Police Department spokespeople maintained that all leads were investigated and none panned out, but the victim claimed that they told her that her story wasn't believable because she would have been killed if she had really been captive for 9 months. Her being alive made her story not add up. That again left John free to continue terrorizing women and girls throughout Syracuse. On August 2, 1999, Dorothy finally succumbed to cancer. John had been holding his victims captive in the house, but the underground bunker was almost completely soundproof. Dorothy was not moving around the house, so he didn't have to be entirely discreet about his activities. Once she died, though, he was completely free to spend all of his efforts on his dark fantasies. There are multiple versions of how John kidnapped his fourth victim, 26-year-old Jennifer Spalding. One involves her walking in downtown Syracuse while under the influence of LSD. In the book I mentioned earlier, the author said she was walking home from her shift at an Outback Steakhouse in DeWitt and was being followed by some other men. So when John offered her a ride, she was probably relieved. Again, there is no other confirmation of that story, and even Jennifer's own account of her abduction doesn't match. In an interview, Jennifer said she was heavily intoxicated, walking from one friend's house to another's when John pulled up and offered her a ride. He drove her to his house and she described trying to get out of the car, but she couldn't open the door from the inside. She said the next thing she knew, she was chained up in the dungeon. When John tried to rape her the first time, Jennifer fought back, so her kidnapper burned her with a cigar. That burn would go untreated and develop into an abscess on her lower back. John told Jennifer that he was part of an underground slavery syndicate that even included members of the police, a story designed to make escape seem futile. Even if she somehow got out of the dungeon, who would she report it to? They were all in on it. John had her write a letter to her family, including 2 young sons, claiming she had entered a drug rehabilitation clinic and should not be disturbed. Her family had filed a missing persons report for Jennifer after her disappearance, but when they received the letter, they recognized her handwriting and vocabulary and contacted the police. The missing persons case was officially closed. The letter had served its purpose perfectly. After about 2.5 months of captivity, John told Jennifer to get dressed, placed a hood on her head, and drove her to her mother's house. He gave her $270 and told her to get out of the car. Just like 2 other victims, Jennifer reported her kidnap and sexual assault to the police, and just like those 2 other victims, they didn't believe her. They used the letter she had written home as evidence that she was lying. They also got a rape kit which came up negative for foreign DNA. It turned out that John had abstained from raping Jennifer in the days before her release to ensure no evidence was left behind. Jennifer also told police that her captor drove a tan 1974 Mercury Comet. Investigators searched in New York State vehicle records for exactly that model and year, found 1 registered vehicle, and when the vehicle did not perfectly match Jennifer's description, they gave up. They did not widen their search to other models or years, something that would have helped since John drove a 1975 Mercury Comet. Later, a representative from the Syracuse Police Department appeared on Dateline NBC and criticized the victim for providing insufficient information. Oh cool, it was the victim's fault. because it seems perfectly reasonable for someone to see a vehicle and be able to know its exact year. Any reasonable person would assume they might be off by a couple of years, but sure, it was Jennifer's fault. In October of 2002, John abducted his final victim, a 16-year-old black runaway from Syracuse. She would prove to be his undoing through her own extraordinary composure and psychological acuity. Over the 6 months of her captivity, the teenager played a long, careful game. She convinced John that she liked him, that she considered him a friend, that she enjoyed his company. She built trust patiently and deliberately, which led to John allowing her out of the dungeon and into the main area of the house. He kept the doors and windows locked to prevent her escape, but as time went on, he believed that she didn't want to escape. Eventually, he felt confident enough to take her outside on outings. First, he took her to a karaoke bar and later to his regular stops around the area. He had done that believing himself safe because, to him, the compliance she demonstrated inside the bunker translated into loyalty. He didn't understand that it was a performance. John was still as frugal as they come and still spent his time collecting and returning empty plastic bottles for cash. On April 3, 2003, he took his captive with him to a bottle depot where she was able to slip away and call her sister. She told her sister that she had been kidnapped and that she was with a rapist before the call was cut off. Her sister checked the caller ID, called the number back, and reached the bottle return center in Manlius where John conducted his weekly recycling. The employee who answered knew John by name, and the sister convinced them to call 911. John and the victim had left the bottle depot and were at a nearby pet store when the police were called, and they arrived in the area quickly. John was tracked down and arrested shortly after. When investigators searched John's property, they were confronted with a scene that defied description. The house itself was jammed with the accumulated detritus of decades of compulsive hoarding. Newspapers and magazines, beer bottles by the thousands, receipts spanning 2 decades, and an assortment of miscellaneous items that had been collected. What John collected seemed entirely indiscriminate. Moving through the property was like wading through the physical manifestation of a disordered mind. Except for the beer bottles. They found 13,000 beer bottles that had been organized by brand, size, and color. Then they found the bunker. The very same bunker that had been described to them by multiple other victims who were not believed. The steel door behind the storage shelf, the crawl-through tunnel, the second locked door, the ladder down into the room. Each element of the architecture communicated the same message to investigators. This was not improvised. Every element of the dungeon had been designed to make escape impossible and keep the existence of the space secret from anyone who might pass through the house above. The crucifix, the slogans on the walls, the stained bathtub on its raised platform, the bucket toilet, all of it spoke to a sustained, systematic operation. The most chilling discovery was a series of calendars. Each victim had been required to mark every day of their captivity with one of 3 letters. B for bathed, T for brushed teeth, and S for sexual activity, which actually meant rape. The collective span of the calendars covered 15 years. John had kept records not out of any administrative necessity, but out of the same compulsion that led him to collect bottles and beer cans. A need to catalog, to control, to impose a system of order over everything within his domain, including the bodies of the women he imprisoned. All 5 were from different ethnic backgrounds: Native American, Latina, Vietnamese, white, and black. It was a diversity that Onondaga County District Attorney William Fitzpatrick later described as deliberate, another form of collection, consistent with the psychology of a man who hoarded everything, including, in the most depraved sense, human beings. Not only had John recorded his crimes in a calendar, several video recordings were found as well. In them, John could be seen dancing, singing, and exercising along with his captives, recordings that appeared to him presumably as evidence of the harmonious relationship he believed he was conducting. In at least one tape, the Vietnamese victim could be seen delivering her plea for her release. It was directed at the members of the supposed underground slavery syndicate that John was part of. He had told the victim that they were planning to sell her and that she needed to plead for her freedom. When investigators went back and asked the other victims what was written on the wall in the dungeon, they immediately repeated the phrase "Wall of Thugs," which confirmed everything the survivors had already told them. All of them had been telling the truth, and the Syracuse police had allowed it to continue. One last piece of evidence found by investigators was a fake sheriff's badge, which John claimed to have found on the street years earlier. He had used it to reinforce his fiction that he was a law enforcement officer conducting kidnappings under orders from supervisors. Combined with his story about the sex slavery syndicate, the badge had served to paralyze his victims in a particularly diabolical way. It implied that reporting to the police would be useless, since the police were part of the system. Despite that not being true, they proved to be useless anyway. There's a long history of law enforcement in the United States not taking sexual assault or kidnapping claims seriously, and despite being able to look back and see those mistakes, it continues to happen. Each year, roughly 125,000 rapes are reported to police across the United States. Yet, from the moment a survivor calls 911, their case faces a gauntlet of skepticism. Police may discourage victims from filing a formal report. If a report is filed, it may not be assigned a detective. If assigned, the case will frequently close with minimal investigation and no arrest. If an arrest does occur, prosecutors may still decline to bring charges. One of the largest problems is what's called the unfounded rate, the classification police use when they consider a report baseless or false. Nationally, police label roughly 1 in 5 reported sexual assault cases as unfounded, a rate far higher than other serious crimes. Some cities, like Baltimore, saw its rape reports decline by 80% since the early 1990s, while its unfounded rate tripled as cases were quietly dismissed rather than investigated. New Orleans showed similar patterns. Those are not isolated aberrations. They reflect a systematic tendency to treat rape allegations with a skepticism applied to almost no other crime. And unfortunately, people take the higher unfounded rate as a sign that more rape reports are fake instead of the truth, that real rape reports are not being investigated. The statistics on false reporting make that skepticism particularly troubling. Multiple rigorous reviews of the evidence consistently find that between 2 and 10% of rape accusations are false, a rate comparable to or even lower than false reporting for other crimes. Yet surveys of police officers reveal a massive gap between perception and reality. Less experienced officers estimate that up to 50% of rape claims are fabricated. Only after more than 7 years of working with victims does that estimate drop to between 8 and 10%, still higher than the actual rate, but far more accurate. That gap between relief and evidence has enormous consequences for the survivors who enter the system hoping for justice. At the root of much police disbelief is a cluster of false and deeply embedded beliefs researchers call rape myths. They're prejudiced, stereotyped attitudes about who can be victims, what constitutes a real assault, and what perpetrators look like. Decades of research show these myths are pervasive in society and that police officers, as members of that society, absorb and sometimes act on them. The archetypal real rape, as defined by rape myth acceptance theory, involves a conservatively dressed female victim who is attacked by a stranger, fights back, sustains visible injuries, and immediately reports the assault in tears. Reality almost never matches that template. The vast majority of rapes are committed by someone the victim knows. Many survivors freeze during an assault, a well-documented trauma response, rather than physically resist. Emotional reactions vary widely. Some survivors cry, some appear calm, some even laugh, all as normal neurological responses to extreme stress. Reporting is frequently delayed, sometimes by days, sometimes by years. When victims don't conform to the idealized image, many officers, particularly inexperienced or untrained ones, default to doubt. Research on sex crimes detectives in Los Angeles found that some detectives regarded victims as essentially guilty until proven innocent. One detective stated plainly that a victim making a claim, quote, does not mean we have to believe them. Studies specifically found officers more likely to doubt victims who knew their alleged attacker, who were intoxicated, who showed no visible injuries, or whose clothing officers deemed provocative. Credibility assessments also suffer from what researchers call the consistency bias. Because trauma disrupts memory encoding and recall, survivors frequently cannot provide linear, detailed accounts of their assault. They may remember fragments out of order, omit details, or fill in gaps differently during repeated interviews. To many officers, that looks like lying. To neuroscientists and trauma-informed practitioners, it looks exactly like the predictable effect of extreme fear on the human brain. The failure to believe rape victims is not evenly distributed. Women of color face compounded barriers at the intersection of gender bias and racial bias. Research shows that race influences police decisions about whether to classify a case as credible and whether to make an arrest. The most vulnerable survivors, those experiencing homelessness, those with mental illness, those with substance use disorders, and sex workers all face the steepest skepticism and the least legal protection. Those are often the people most targeted by serial predators and the least likely to receive justice. This case is a perfect example of those biases. The 1995 victim, a 14-year-old Latina with a history of drug use, told police what had happened and provided a description. Investigators questioned her credibility based on her background and dropped the case. The 1997 to 1998 victim, a Vietnamese refugee who spoke limited English, reported the crime the same day she was released and was not believed. The 2001 victim, Jennifer Spalding, also with a history of drug use, reported the crimes and even gave a description of John's car, but was still brushed off. Obviously, the major problem with a sexual assault claim being dismissed is that the perpetrator continues to operate, but the harm extends far beyond the failure to catch a predator. Research documents that being disbelieved by police causes what scholars call secondary victimization, a second wave of trauma layered on top of the original assault. Survivors describe losing trust in institutions, experiencing deepened shame and self-blame, and withdrawing further from the help-seeking they desperately needed. Studies tracking survivors who were not believed by police found that many turned to alcohol or drugs as coping mechanisms. Symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder worsened. The experience of reaching out, of enduring both the assault and the courage it takes to report, and then being met with skepticism or outright dismissal, compounded the original injury rather than beginning to heal it. That in turn makes people less likely to report crimes in the future. If it happens to the victim again, or if it happens to someone they know, why would they report it when they know the police won't believe them? And when perpetrators go free because their victims aren't believed, they continue to offend. Once the other victims' stories were confirmed and news of the arrest went public, Kristen came forward to report she was also one of John's victims. On June 11, 2003, John Jamelske pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree kidnapping. The plea agreement was structured with the victim's well-being explicitly in mind. By pleading guilty, each of the 5 women would be spared the additional trauma of testifying about their experiences in open court. Most of the victims' identities were never made public as a result, and they remain protected to this day. Jennifer Spalding is the exception, as she chose to come forward publicly. As part of the plea agreement, John's assets, including his real estate investments, the proceeds from the sale of his home, and whatever remained of the more than $1 million he had accumulated, were liquidated and divided among his victims as financial compensation. The house at 7070 Highbridge Road was eventually put up for sale. The dungeon was destroyed. In July of 2003, Onondaga County Judge Anthony Alloy sentenced John Jamelske to 18 years to life in prison. John, who had apparently believed until very late in the proceedings that his legal situation would resolve itself with minimal consequences, seemed genuinely shocked by the severity of the outcome, despite the reality that it was a fairly light sentence. In a prison interview with MSNBC that aired in 2004, he said he thought he would at most spend a couple of days in jail, pay a fine, or do community service, and that his attorneys had needed to spend several days after his arrest making clear to him that what he had done was in fact kidnapping.
I'm thinking, maybe I'm going to get some community service or something of that nature for a little bit of unlawful imprisonment or whatever.
John became eligible for his first parole hearing after serving the 18-year minimum of his sentence. The hearing took place virtually on December 15, 2020, with John, then 85 years old, connecting by video from Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora. When asked to reflect on his crimes, John described a version of events that bore almost no relationship to the facts he had admitted to in his own guilty plea. He said, quote, "I had a bunker and people knew I had a bunker. We partied a lot out there, and I was approached every now and then by someone that said it would be a good idea for a friend of hers that's a runaway to be there rather than out on the streets, and that they came and, as a trade-off, we had sex." He said he had met the women and girls at block parties or encountered them partying in the street. He went on to say of the bunker that, quote, "Most of the time the door wasn't even closed." All 5 of the victims had told prosecutors they were held against their will, but John denied that. When pressed, he acknowledged that he had probably inadvertently caused harm. He made the strange claim that he could have talked them into returning to their families sooner, as if it was his victim's choice to stay with them. He also told the board that he had provided his captives with scented candles and bubble baths, a detail that was so bewildering in context that it seemed to reveal more vividly than any of his other statements the complete absence of moral understanding.
I did not rape her.
John had been enrolled in a sex offender program during his incarceration, but had been removed from it for poor participation. He dismissed the program as not worth engaging with. He also told the parole board that after releasing his victims, he had maintained social contact with them, saying he would stop by and hang out with them for a while, and that their failure to call the police on those occasions proved they had no real grievance against him. The 5th victim, he noted with some regret, he didn't get the chance to visit after her release. Because she called the police and reported that she had been kidnapped and raped by him. John once said in an interview, quote, "I never considered anybody a kidnap victim. To me, somebody that's kidnapped is, you pick out somebody who has money and you grab them and you say, I'm going to kill them if you don't give me $500,000 or something." Yeah, John, that's called kidnap and ransom. The ransom is in addition to the kidnapping. Just because you didn't ask for money doesn't mean it's illegal to grab someone and hold them against their will. The parole board denied his release the same day, citing his inability to grasp the harm and trauma caused to his victims and his refusal to meaningfully engage with rehabilitation programming. They said, quote, "Your responses indicate that you did not fully understand the harm you caused to your victims, evidenced by you justifying your inappropriate and abusive behavior." He was denied parole again in December of 2022 and in October of 2023, when the board imposed a 24-month hold on any further considerations. As of the most recent available records, John, now 91 and housed in the medical unit of the Mohawk Correctional Facility, remains incarcerated. The 5 women and girls John imprisoned carried the weight of their experiences in ways that are largely private, as most of them have remained anonymous. Jennifer Spalding, who chose to identify herself publicly, became an important public figure in the aftermath of the case. Her decision to speak out was significant not only for its personal courage, but for the light it cast on the investigative failures that preceded John Jamelske's arrest. Her experience of reporting the crime and being disbelieved, an experience shaped in part by the coerced letter John had forced her to write to her family, became a focal point for the broader discussions about how the justice system handles reports from victims at society's margins. The 5th victim, the 16-year-old girl whose composure and strategic thinking ended John's crimes, has also remained anonymous. What is known of her is that she spent 6 months in the dungeon and emerged from it having successfully outwitted a kidnapper who had eluded law enforcement for 15 years. The detail of her patience, building trust over months, performing friendship convincingly enough to earn outdoor privileges, then using a few seconds of unsupervised access to a phone to undo everything her captor had built is one of the most remarkable aspects of a case that contains many remarkable and terrible details. In the end, John Jamelske was a monster, and not only are his actions reprehensible, they're only made worse by his refusal to take responsibility. But John had help with his crimes. If the authorities had taken earlier reports seriously, he might have been stopped sooner. The victims were re-victimized by the police when they refused to seek justice for them. John will likely never be released from prison, but is he the only monster in this story? Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.